Hello, everybody. My name is Aaron Christensen. This is Horror 101 with Dr. AC, and this is Scare-A-Thon 2023, benefiting the Women's Reproductive Rights Assistance Project. We are in the home stretch of Scare-A-Thon 2023, and tonight we're going to be talking about the incredible documentary Boris Karloff, The Man Behind the Monster, which is streaming now on Shudder. And to talk to me about Mr. Karloff, I have this amazing panel assembled consisting of Jon Kitley, Alan Tromp,
hello,
Grant Kuchan, Anna Maurya, and Chad Hawks. And again, we're talking about Boris Karloff, the man behind the monster. What's interesting about this is that I first heard about this through Shout Factory because it's co-produced by Shout Studio. But oddly enough, it didn't end up with Shout Factory. It ended up over on Shudder. But anyway, I'm really thrilled to be talking about this. And what a great panel we have tonight. Thank you all for coming on. Jon, I'm going to let you have the honors because I know you are probably the biggest Boris Karloff fan that I know. What was your first impression of the documentary? And then talk a little bit about your relationship with Mr. Karloff.
Honestly, any documentary that covers Karloff's career, I'm in for. So when I heard about this, I was very excited, especially that it was a feature length as opposed to the typical 50-minute or 60-minute little bio thing. I've ever since Frankenstein. I mean, I grew up watching him on TV, and obviously The Grinch That Stole Christmas was probably my first introduction to him without really knowing. But Frankenstein is one of my all-time favorite films. Plus, Karloff as an actor, I think redefines what most people think of a horror actor because he's so good that no matter what he's in, he still brings it. And so I'm always excited to see something on him. Plus, it's even better when you see the other influence that he's had on other filmmakers and other actors that just sit there in awe of this guy. And it's one of those that just you go to and it's just fun to watch and go, yep, that guy's awesome. Yep.
Let's bounce over to Alan. What was your introduction to Karloff?
I think most probably I saw a snippet of Bride of Frankenstein, on one of the afternoon creature features when I was growing up. But honestly, I think right after that, the next one would have been a much later film he made, probably Frankenstein 1970, in which he's all scarred up and mutilated. So I don't, you don't get really good representative view of him. But in addition to that, some of the things that really impressed me about him is the range of characters that he managed to play, his ability to participate in comedy as well, often lampooning himself in many times that he did, the wide variety of things that he worked on. And he gives me an impression of time of this is, I think there may have been other people who've been mentioned who had this sort of accolade before, but he's the sort of person everybody would want for their grandfather. He just gives that aura to him, to himself. So, I guess those are some of the reminiscences that I have of him.
Yeah, very, very classy guy. Let's circle down to Grant.
Well, after the Grinch Who Stole Christmas, because I think we all had that one, growing up, we're all sort of an age where that was our first. But after that, my first real exposure was Abbott and Costello Meet the Killer. And I even saw that before I actually saw Frankenstein. I saw it as a young kid and just loved it. Loved, how spooky he was. And and it was Abbott and Costello who I loved at the time. So I ate all of it up. So. And
Anna.
It was The Grinch. I mean, that was it for me. I have to credit my mom introducing that to me. I mean, I think she was a big Karloff fan, and just loved his voice. So that was my first exposure. But then, of course, Frankenstein, pretty hot on the heels of that. I feel like he's kind of always been part of our household in some way or another. Even though I didn't, get to see anything that he did, live, so to speak. He's just always been part of our lives.
Yeah, I feel like he Lon Chaney Sr. and Bela Lugosi were kind of our first three true horror icons. We're like, oh, those are the actors who make the monsters,
Mhm.
And Chad?
I grew up in a no horror environment, so aside from the Grinch, of course, it was really his voice. In very circumnavigational there with Bobby Boris Pickett, who took not only Karloff's name, but also his voice, growing up to realize, oh my God, there's a reason that he took that name. And then also Mad Monster Party, which
Yes.
I was
Forgot about
allowed
that
to
one.
watch. If you can make it through Phyllis Diller, you get just that whole gentle, good-natured Karloff as himself, basically. So that was really my introduction, and then the joy of going back and catching up on so much work that's just so amazing.
My introduction to a lot of these movies was reference books at the library. And I just remember going, wow, Boris Karloff did that and that and that and that and that. It's like he really was the horror guy. Curious to hear, like, what were some fun facts that people learned from the documentary? Because, like many of you, I've watched a number of featurettes. I thought I did know pretty much all there was to know about Karloff, but I found myself going, oh wow, that's news.
I didn't know about his family background. I appreciated that like little dive into that part of his life, because we really just know about like the horror or the films that he's made or the TV shows. But there was some like real human horror that he was dealing with, some personal terrible situation with his father, and then his brother being accused of murder and having to deal with that, his family having to deal with that, and then his mom was like, I can't even raise this one. Like, I mean, just such a sense of what had to be, this feeling of loss for him. So that was really, for me, kind of surprising, and it makes you wonder like how much that may have informed some of his performances when you think about how sympathetic the monster is in Frankenstein, for example, and showing some nuance in there if maybe some of his life experiences didn't inform that.
Yeah, I wasn't aware of his father being of Indian descent, and I was like, oh wow, because we mostly have always seen Karloff in black and white until we get to the later days. So like they were talking about his darker skin, and I was like, Boris Karloff is somebody who would have been labeled as ethnic, and I'm like, I never would have realized that. So that was a real eye opener for me.
Well, for me, and I know, I mean, there's no reason why it should have been, but how much they were talking to his daughter. I mean, he had kids, he had a daughter, and how warmly she was talking about, everything with the Grinch and how he made that specifically for the grandkids. And, he had grandkids, he had a family, but now that's somebody's dad, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's watching him be that sort of warm person that you want on your side and have that be somebody who actually was that person was really, very nice to see.
Well, and to your point, Anna, like the fact that he did have, some struggles, but it seems like he just basically kept that off to the side. That was not something he was public about. And it was, it was just one of those things where I give him just so much more credit for being the seemingly well-adjusted. I mean, he did have 5 marriages, so perhaps he wasn't the easiest person to be married to.
Yeah, but I mean, we get a little bit of that too when with the "This Is Your Life" thing, and like how upset he was about that. I mean, I think most people would kind of be like, shocked and then sort of go with it, and he was just like clearly grumpy through like every clip except when like Jack Pierce comes out. He's just like not having any of it. But then, also come to find out he was also diagnosed with emphysema like literally that same night. So that was a man in a health crisis and in like hey, you're laying out like kind of my personal life that maybe I've tried to keep down. So
well, and I think it was clearly an effort for him. I mean, he was like, it was a choice for him not to be public with any of that, and so to have that and to be kind of ambushed in that way, I mean, they meant for it to be a pleasant surprise, but best of intentions.
He was not happy about that, and if you see the whole episode of This Is Your Life, there was one point where he did a stage play of Arsenic and Old Lace in Alaska that they were trying to raise money for their theater to build a new theater. And they had the guy that ran the theater come down and was a guest on This Is Your Life. And he starts to tell a story because Karloff deferred his payment. He gave them his payment as a donation. And this guy starts to tell that. And Karloff is visibly like, no, don't, because he wants his private life private.
Yeah.
And you got to have a lot of respect for someone that was like that. And it's funny how I agree, but Karloff was one of those actors that he plays such an evil character in some films, but then he can also smile at you and be very amusing, but still look at you like this guy's going to kill me. He can still present that creepiness even though he's smiling at you, and not a lot of actors can really do that.
I really got his just genuine humanity, and I think I interpreted his shyness almost as I don't know if it's common, but an actor's they gravitate towards the spotlight, but that's to play another role. That's to take on another persona. But as soon as that spotlight is about them, there's that defensiveness of like, no, this isn't about me. Don't look at me.
Yeah.
And especially when it comes to all the wonderful things he did with the Early Actors Guild and just the humanitarian efforts he underwent and wanted no applause and no credit. That I found the whole documentary to be pretty emotional, and combined with that episode of This Is Your Life, to know that there's a prognosis on the horizon, not knowing it was that night, of course, but that could have been a heavy double whammy of hey, we only do this for people that are kind of in the last few years of their career or worse. So wonderful documentary though.
I like the fact that it starts off with Black Sabbath, which is kind of his renaissance. Like that was just after he'd come back with Roger Corman that same year. It was the first time he'd been on film in like 5 years. But I like the fact that they talk about how you saw the old man, the stately gentleman doing the hosting, which is kind of what he did for Thriller and The Veil on television. But when he plays that Vertilac vampire character and you just watch him kind of transform into an actor again, and he has that energy and he has all that intention and all the stuff going on behind the eyes. I was like, because we just talked about that on the show not too long ago. And one of our panelists was like, I love older Boris Karloff because there's so, and I forget who mentions it, maybe it's been Guillermo del Toro, but they talk about how much kind of gravity and kind of mastery of the craft that he's bringing with him now. He's bringing those, 40 years of experience to bear. Alan, you and I talked beforehand, actually. You were talking about how you liked a lot of the older stuff, but there were also like movies that they didn't talk about that you wish they'd showcased.
back from when we used to trade VHS tapes and things like that. One thing I'd like to mention is now I guess most everything is available through streaming services, but for a long time it was really hard to access early Boris Karloff, some of his lesser known films. I mean, I think it took me forever after seeing pictures of The Devil Commands in
Mm.
Phil, Dennis Gifford's book on pictorial history of horror movies to finally see that movie. I think I had to order a copy from George Stover from all the uh, uh, from his Cinemacabre video from the guy from the John Waters and Don Dohler films. He had a copy of it, and I loved it. And I still don't think I've seen all of like those early films like The Man Who Changed His Mind
Oh, sure.
and
Yeah.
a lot of those early Mads or maybe The Ape that he was in. I still don't know if I've seen those. I kind of had hoped that they did focus some of those, but um I they and maybe they couldn't get the rights to them, but they didn't show anything for Die Monster Die.
Yeah. Mm.
Uh The Walking Dead, I thought was a really good 1940s movie that he did, and again, maybe it plays into the comedy thing. A favorite of my parents that he was in was You'll Find Out with Kay
Oh,
Kaiser,
yeah.
because Kay Kaiser was a favorite band leader of theirs in the swing era, and so you've got that one, and you got the Kay Kaiser movie, and you also have The Boogeyman Will Get You. So I would have loved to have seen those that he was in.
It is
Um,
interesting. Sorry, it is interesting
no,
that it is only like 100 minutes long, and it does feel like, yes, there's so much more you could talk about. I remember when we were doing the Robert Englund documentary. It's like people who are here to hear about Boris Karloff, they're not going to be like, you know what, I've had enough. Let time out. Grant.
Well, what's interesting is with the Blu-ray that you can get, they have a second one that covers and
Oh,
everything else. So
oh,
it's
great.
basically for those who are the hardcore fans, if you get the 2-disc version, you will be able to find, I think, pretty much everything you're talking about and more. So yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you, Grant. Thank
You're
you for your
welcome.
service. Way to go the extra mile. We have Roger Corman, we have Dick Miller, we have Leonard Maltin, Guillermo del Toro, John Landis, Joe Dante, David J. Schall, Gregory Mank, who has written how many books on Karloff at this point?
I think only the one on him and Lugosi, the Haunting Collaboration, I think.
Okay.
But I think he's written a few books on different movies that Karloff is represented.
I also like the fact that Ron Perlman kind of comes on as a journeyman actor and saying, this is what actors go through. And, there's this illusion that it's all, red carpets and, opening night parties. And it's like, yeah. And there's also the producers who are like, well, let's just shoot for 24 hours straight. And you're like, hang on, you want me to show up tomorrow, right? Because I have a life to live and I have a career that I want to keep going. And I need to be well as a human being in order to do that. And I thought it was great because Karloff had gone through those really tough times when they didn't have those restrictions. And, the fact that James Whale is not shown in the best light in this documentary, in that he had Karloff literally carrying Colin Clive over his back over and over and over again. And this is Karloff who already has back issues.
Yeah. And again, that leads completely into why he was very adamant in starting the Screen Actors Guild, because he knows what he went through and he cannot be the only one. So he wanted to make sure to give the other actors that same protection. So anybody that does that, aside from his incredible acting ability, but to I think Chad's point, as far as being just the humanity of him, I mean, he was fighting for everybody's rights, and you got to give him credit for that.
Well, it was interesting because we did kind of like start off in mid-career and we went back a little bit. And then about like a half hour into the documentary, he goes, by the way, let's talk about the man behind the monster. It's like, we just like, it wasn't linear at all. It was like, we're going to talk for half hour. You know what? Let me introduce you to Boris Karloff over here, because that's when all of the information about his family and his history and his early films, his work in silent films and his work in the theater, like the fact that I didn't realize that he, spent as much time as he had in Canada.
He welcomed fame much differently than other actors because he had already been a working actor for, I think, 2 decades and was, borderline poverty. So I think when this happened, it didn't, he's not one that went, oh, I'm a big star. I can, he was very humble about his, because he always said that his role was you could throw a brick out of a window and he was the lucky one that got hit, really diminishing his actual talent. So I think it goes back to him as a person.
He mentioned that himself, right? Where he was offered the role, the live performances, and he said, I'm not a real actor. He had
the idea of being on Broadway.
He definitely had some imposter syndrome there, where granted, in the 1910s, you could completely lie about your acting resume to get a job on stage. But I mean, he had done the groundwork by that point. He was such an actor, and yet he still felt hesitant to get on that stage again.
I like the fact that we talk about the Universals. They really give some good solid screen time to his films with Val Lewton, which I feel like when we talk about Val Lewton, we oftentimes talk about Cat People and, Leopard Man and I Walk with a Zombie, but we don't always circle deep enough to get into Boris Karloff's 3 films for Lewton, which I think are some of the best Lewton films. And they're also some of the best performances that Karloff did. Like his Isle of the Dead is terrific. Body Snatcher is incredible. And Bedlam. I love all 3 of those.
He credits Val Lewton for saving his career because he gave him the chance to do the Body Snatcher, which was not a monster in a suit or makeup. It was a real human character. And that is one of my favorite of his performance because, as I mentioned before, he could smile at you and still chill you.
I was just going to mention, specifically talking about Isle of the Dead, I had no idea that the original concept from that movie, the script for it, came from a painting. And they mentioned with that was a complete surprise to me. That was very interesting.
Well, one of the stories that you said, Chad, that got me a little emotional was the idea that he was on the Red Skelton show with Vincent Price, and he was literally sitting in the wings in a wheelchair with an oxygen mask. And you're like, because I've been backstage when people are sick or they're unwell, and then you watch them get on stage and it's, Dr. Greasepaint, and you're like, I would never know that person is sick. And then they come backstage and they're like, throw up in a bucket and then go back out again. And I'm like, the audience never knows what that performer is going through. And I think Karloff was that much of a professional where he's just like, I have to give them the best that I have. And then, like when it's done, I'm going to collapse back in my wheelchair and slap my oxygen mask back on.
Years ago, I interviewed Jack Hill, who directed Karloff on his last 4 features.
Right. The Mexican ones.
At the time, Karloff was on Life magazine for his 80th birthday. And Jack Hill told me that he had asked Karloff about, they're still talking about Frankenstein after all this time. Now, as a horror fan, one of the things that irritates me is when actors or directors belittle the genre. And here's Karloff at 80 years old, and he said, I'm on the cover of Life magazine because of that movie. People still know who I am because of that movie. He'd never talked down about it. He always called the monster his friend. And also, to your point, Aaron, Hill said that when he's off camera, he's in a wheelchair with the oxygen thing on. But Hill asked him, why don't you retire? And he says, I'm an actor. I can't. This is what I do. He can't. I think he was afraid if he did stop acting, there's nothing left.
Right.
And he literally acted until he couldn't anymore.
And Targets, so so parallel to real life in so many ways, and sadly contemporary life. But the fact that he said, "This is it. This will be the one that I'm going out on," and then went on to do several.
Just couldn't help himself. You had a great final bow, and then you're like, you know what? I'm bored. I gotta get out there and do some films
Like
with
several
Jack Hill.
more curtain calls after that. Like, get the giant hook out, for God's sake, this poor guy.
Sit this guy
There is that great scene in Targets where he gets up from the bed and scares himself by looking in the mirror as he walks by. And again, I think Alan mentioned that he could do comedy, and it's just, you don't expect that. And he's, and then goes to answer the door. I thought it was hilarious.
Well, I remember seeing Targets because it was one that I read in reference books, and it was kind of like, modern horror. It was just as it was turning that corner into the 70s. And I remember watching it for the first time, and the scene that they reference, where he does that unbroken take of the story. I remember noticing that. I'm like, they haven't cut. They have not cut. He is telling this entire story from beginning to end, like the trained theatrical actor that he is. He's like, no, I'm just going to do the whole thing. And that story is remarkable. If you haven't seen Targets, I highly recommend it. But that story, that telling of it, is an absolute highlight in a movie that is full of highlights.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I think is funny in parallel is that in Targets, the idea is that the old creaking chains and the castles and the Gothic stuff is not scary anymore. These modern day psychos are scary.
Right.
But I'm fortunate enough to have a copy of the 77 Sunset Strip episode he made. Was it Lizard Legs and Owlet Wings, I think it's called. And he gets together with Lon Chaney Jr. and also Peter Lorre, and they wind up all dressing up. Lon Chaney is the mummy and werewolf, and Peter Lorre wears a top hat and cape, and Karloff puts on the Frankenstein outfit again, and they wound up scaring the bejesus out of a convention of secretaries who were on Sunset Strip, and they're like, we still got it, we can do another project like this. So it's the complete opposite message from what was in Targets.
Well, again, this is a fantastic documentary, streaming now on Shudder and apparently available on physical media for those who, are willing to take that extra effort. I'm so glad we all got to chat tonight, and thank you, Alan and Chad, for coming on the show. It was great to have you.
Just one other thing that they touched on, and I forgot that I had one of these till they mentioned it, is I forgot all the children's albums that Karloff recorded for like Cademon and other places like that. I mean, here's this guy with this, like we were mentioning, the voice, reading like Chicken Little and Baa Black Sheep and things for the kids. I just thought that was fantastic.
All right. Well, thank you all so much, everybody. Again, this is Scare-A-Thon 2023, benefiting the Women's Reproductive Rights Assistance Project. The link to donate is below in the description of this video, so please make a contribution. There's still a few days left. And until next time, keep searching, keep exploring, and keep sharing the scare.